There is a strange moment every adaptation has to survive. It happens when a story leaves the page and enters the screen. That is the point where the author's intent meets the director's intent, where the private voice of a book has to compete with the public force of cinema. And that collision is never clean. Sometimes the film becomes the definitive version. Sometimes it becomes the warning sign. Sometimes it is praised for being faithful and still feels dead. Sometimes it changes a lot and somehow understands the soul of the original better than anything else ever could. That is why adaptation arguments never really die. They just keep mutating. Fans do not just ask, was it accurate? They ask something much harder. Did it feel right? Did it preserve the heart of the story? Did it understand why the original mattered in the first place? That is the real battlefield, not faithfulness versus betrayal, not book versus movie. It is authorship versus interpretation, and the stakes are higher than most studio marketing would like to admit. A film is not just a copy of a book with moving pictures. It is a new claim on the story. And once that claim is made, the audience has to decide whose version they believe. The authors, the directors, or the one that survives in culture long after the credits roll.
How are we going to defeat Medusa? By using your bravery and my intelligence. Here, take this glass. The convexity should cause some distortion, but according to my calculations, it'll work. Guys, how are we going to defeat Medusa? By using your bravery and my intelligence. Here, I've got a smart creative solution. We'll use the invisibility cap so she can't turn you to stone. How am I supposed to defeat Medusa? I'm just a 30-year-old kid. Wait, I'll use what all the hip teens are using nowadays. An iPod. Where's Annabeth?
I'm driving the car with my eyes closed.
This video is Authorial Intent versus Director Vision, how the complex ethics of changing source material impacts films, filmmakers, and the community of people, the fans of the original source material watching these movies. If you are a fan of the Resident Evil games, do you remember what you felt when you first saw the Resi movies? That is the exact conundrum and the scenario we will explore in this video essay. Come, let's delve deeper and explore this wonderful, albeit sometimes scary world of adaptations. A novel is not a finished image. It is a blueprint for an image. The reader supplies the faces, the weather, the timing, the emotion between the lines. That is why two people can read the same book and walk away with slightly different movies in their heads. The author does not hand over a complete world. They hand over a set of instructions for how to imagine one. Film changes that immediately. It fixes things. It decides what the room looks like. It decides how the character sounds.
Make your move! She's a girl! Where do I grab her?
It decides when the silence ends. It turns infinite possibility into one visible interpretation. That is why directors matter so much in adaptation. They are not just reproducing text, they are choosing what kind of experience survives the transfer. Denis Villeneuve has described adaptation as an act of treason, saying, when you adapt, you kill. You destroy in the process of transformation. That sounds brutal, but it is actually honest. He also said he tried to keep, quote, the poetry of the book, the atmosphere, the colors, the smell of Dune, which is exactly the kind of thinking good adapters need. They do not ask how to preserve every word. They ask how to preserve the feeling that made the words unforgettable. That is the friction at the center of every adaptation. The author creates meaning inside language. The director has to externalize meaning through image, rhythm, casting, editing, and sound. Once that happens, the story is no longer only the author's. It has been translated, and translation always leaves a trace of loss. But loss is not automatically failure. Sometimes that loss is the price of making the story alive in a new medium. Some adaptations do more than survive the transfer. They eclipse the source. The Godfather is the obvious example. It is one of the clearest cases where the film version became larger in the popular imagination than the novel itself. Box Office Mojo lists The Godfather at $136.4 million domestic, and Jaws at $280.1 million domestic. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The real point is cultural dominance. These films did not just retell the books, they became the versions people, quote, reference and remember first. That happens when a director understands what to cut and what to amplify. Jaws is a perfect case of reduction used intelligently. The novel has more material, but the film has tighter suspense, cleaner structure, and a visual language that turns absence into terror.
Right, stand, Jack 350! Red one. Mark, you got out of the water.
The shark is feared because the movie knows when not to show it. That is not a betrayal of the source. That is medium intelligence. Harry Potter is another fascinating example. In a 2016 poll of 2,000 cinemagoers, Harry Potter topped the list of best book-to-film adaptations, with 32% placing the series in their top 10. That tells you something important. Even when the books are richer, denser, and more detailed, the films can still become the emotional default for millions of people. The lesson is uncomfortable, but necessary. Fidelity is not the same thing as success. Sometimes the best adaptation is the one that understands what the book is trying to do, then uses cinema to do it differently. Some adaptations do not just succeed as films, they become cultural systems. They stop being one movie and start becoming a language, a fan memory, a franchise logic, a set of expectations that can survive redesigns, sequels, backlash, and reinvention. That is why some properties become bigger than the books or games they came from.
First, we get together, have a few laughs.
They do not merely adapt a source, they build a new canon around it. Take Sonic the Hedgehog. The first trailer was met with such intense backlash that Paramount publicly committed to redesigning the character, and the story of that redesign became almost as famous as the film itself. Jeff Fowler acknowledged the criticism directly, and later reporting described the frantic race to fix Sonic before release. By the time Sonic the Hedgehog 3 arrived, the franchise had settled into a much better groove, with Rotten Tomatoes showing an 86% critic score and Box Office Mojo recording a $62 million domestic opening. That makes Sonic a rare example of an adaptation that listened, corrected course, and found a version of itself the audience actually wanted. The MCU is the other giant example. It did not just adapt comic book characters, it adapted the entire idea of serialized reading into franchise cinema. Rotten Tomatoes currently places Iron Man at 94%.
I am Iron Man.
Black Panther at 96%, and Avengers Endgame at 94%, which tells you something important. The MCU's best entries are not simply accurate to the comics. They are built around the same long-form emotional accumulation that comics thrive on. Endgame then pushed that logic to its commercial peak, crossing $2.7892 billion globally, and becoming the highest-grossing film in the world at the time. In other words, the MCU became proof that adaptation can scale into a system when the audience is not just watching stories, but following an evolving universe. Twilight is a different kind of success, and that is exactly why it belongs here. It shows that an adaptation can become culturally massive, even when critics remain unconvinced. Rotten Tomatoes currently lists Twilight at 48% critics and 72% audience, Eclipse at 46% and 60%, Breaking Dawn Part 1 at 26% and 60%. And Breaking Dawn Part 2 at 49% and 70%. That gap is the story. Twilight was never just about prestige adaptation, it was about emotional identification, fandom, fantasy, and mood.
My time as a human is over, but I never felt more alive.
It proved that a franchise can be dismissed by critics and still become the defining emotional text for an entire generation. The Hunger Games sits at the other end of the spectrum, because it is one of the clearest examples of a franchise that remained broadly faithful while still becoming stronger in motion. Rotten Tomatoes ranks the first film at 84% and Catching Fire at 90%, with the consensus calling Catching Fire energetic, thoughtful, and tense. That matters, because the films did not merely preserve the plot, they preserved Katniss's moral pressure, the oppressive political atmosphere, and the sense that every choice has consequences, while tightening the structure enough for cinema. This is what good adaptation often looks like, not exact replication, but faithful compression with purpose. And then there's Sherlock Holmes. Not just an adaptation, but an entire ecosystem of them, over a century of reinterpretations. From classic period pieces to modern reinventions, from hyperlogical detectives to almost mythic geniuses, because Sherlock Holmes was never meant to have just one definitive version. He's a character built on an idea, not a fixed form. Intelligence, observation, deduction, And every generation reshapes those ideas in its own image.
James Moriarty. Sherlock is making friends.
Sherlock never made any friends.
What game are we playing today? What game would you like to play?
That's why Holmes survives adaptation so effortlessly. Not because he's protected from change, but because he's designed for it. Where most stories break under reinterpretation, Sherlock evolves through it. Each version isn't replacing the original. It's answering the same question differently. What does genius look like now? And if you move away from global franchises and into regional storytelling, the same pattern emerges in a more intimate way. Take Feluda, a detective rooted in Kolkata, created by Satyajit Ray, yet shaped by a global literary lineage that traces back to Sherlock Holmes. Feluda isn't just an adaptation of a genre, he's a cultural translation of it. His world feels specific, local, textured with language, environment, and social nuance, and yet the core appeal remains universal. Curiosity, intelligence, moral clarity, and that's why Feluda works across mediums, because the adaptations don't just recreate the stories, they preserve the spirit of the character. Now contrast that with Byomkesh Bakshi, another iconic Bengali detective, equally rooted in literature, equally adapted across film and television. But here, the reception has been more uneven. Some versions capture the quiet intensity, the observational depth, the almost philosophical nature of the character. Others miss it entirely. And that difference reveals something important. Adaptation isn't just about the source, it's about interpretation. Because even within the same cultural space, with the same audience, the same language, the same literary roots, one version can feel definitive, and another can feel completely disconnected. Together, these examples expand the idea of adaptation beyond Hollywood. Because this isn't just a debate about budgets, or spectacle, or global franchises. It's about how stories travel, across mediums, across cultures, across generations, and what happens to them along the way. Every adaptation has to cut. That is not a creative sin, it is survival. Books can wander. Films have to move. A novel can spend pages inside a character's mind, can open side paths, can linger in description, can delay payoff because the prose itself is part of the pleasure. A movie has to earn attention in real time. It cannot ask the audience to pause while it thinks. It has to decide what matters now. That is where the scissors come in. The best adapters use them with surgical care. They remove subplots that distract from the emotional spine. They merge characters when too many voices weaken the line of force. They compress events when the theme can survive compression. The worst adapters cut mechanically, or worse, they refuse to cut at all and end up making something that feels like a summary instead of a story. This is where Paul W.S. Anderson's Resident Evil films become an interesting case. They were commercially viable, with the franchise spreading across multiple entries and the first film in the series opening a path to a long-running blockbuster cycle. But they also made a very clear decision to leave the survival horror grammar of the games behind and lean hard into action spectacle. One GameSpot report notes that Anderson intentionally abandoned a slavish game adaptation, and the box office history shows that the franchise could still make money even while moving away from the core feel of the source. Resident Evil itself grossed $40.1 million domestic and $103 million worldwide. While later entries like Apocalypse and Afterlife also pulled in meaningful numbers. That is the central question. If a film uses the title, the icons, and the brand, but leaves behind the tone, the tension, and the emotional architecture.
Get the hell out of here before it's too late.
Is it still an adaptation? Or just a franchise wearing a familiar face?
Wait a minute! Who are you?
The most famous recent example of a failure that became a fandom movie is Percy Jackson. Rick Riordan did not hide his feelings. In a Guardian interview, he said of the first film script, "The script as a whole is terrible," and added that it had become almost unrecognizable as the same story. He also said the fans were bitterly disappointed by the movies, which is exactly why the franchise became such a lightning rod in the first place. The 2010 Lightning Thief film sits at 48% critics and 53% audience on Rotten Tomatoes, and it made $226.5 million worldwide. which is a useful reminder that commercial success and adaptation satisfaction are not the same metric. A movie can make money and still fail at the one thing that matters to the fandom. It can also be impossible to dismiss completely, because some viewers will always prefer the energy of the film, even if the source changes were not well received. That tension is the entire point. The issue is never just faithful or not. It is whether the changes serve the new medium or strip away the soul of the original. Now here is the trap from the other side. A movie can be too faithful and still fail. That sounds impossible until you see it happen. A production copies the plot beats, preserves the dialogue, keeps the iconic moments, and still somehow produces something flat. The problem is that books and films reward different kinds of attention. The page can absorb internal monologue. The screen needs movement, rhythm, and emotional pressure.
Dinosaur. But of course, this went right in one ear.
I love how he cares so much about stuff. If I squint, I can pretend he's Alan Alda.
Oh good, another dinosaur story.
If a director treats the book like a sacred document that cannot be rearranged, the result can feel static, even if it is technically accurate.
Boring!
Roger Ebert put this plainly when he wrote, "Faithfulness in adaptation is not necessarily a virtue. This is a movie, and not a marriage." That line has endured because it cuts through the noise. A film has to justify itself as cinema, not as a photocopy. Take Watchmen. On paper, it's one of the most faithful comic book adaptations ever made. The framing, the dialogue, the iconic panels, even entire sequences are recreated, almost shot for shot from the original graphic novel. And yet, something feels off. Not because it's wrong, but because it's too right. The film preserves the structure, but struggles to recreate the experience of reading it. The original graphic novel works because of pacing, because of how you move between panels, because of the quiet space where meaning builds in your mind. But when that same structure is transferred directly onto the screen, without reinterpreting it for cinema, it becomes heavy, static, almost suffocating in its own accuracy. This is where Sin City, a film made by Robert Rodriguez along with the creator of the original graphic novel Frank Miller, exceeds in creating a grounded, yet absurd neo-noir anthology film that captures the soul of the original and then transcends it. If adaptation is a negotiation, then the best recent examples show what happens when both sides are respected. The Last of Us is the clearest proof that a faithful adaptation can still feel alive if it understands the medium. Rotten Tomatoes currently lists Season 1 at 96% tomatometer, based on 488 reviews, with an 86% popcorn meter. Its critics' consensus says it is retaining the most addictive aspects of its beloved source material while digging deeper into the story. That is the ideal sentence for adaptation, because it describes preservation and expansion in the same breath. Percy Jackson and the Olympians is the other side of the same lesson, but this time the adaptation course-corrected publicly. The series currently sits at 95% average tomatometer, 97 reviews, and 82% popcorn meter on its main page. Season 1 is listed at 91%, and Season 2 at 100%. Fans and critics responded so strongly because the show did something the films often did not. It made the world feel like Percy Jackson again, not just look like it. One Piece is an even more interesting case, because it was the adaptation many people expected to collapse under its own scale. Instead, it landed at 93% average tomatometer, 89 reviews, and 95% popcorn meter, with Season 1 at 86%, and Season 2 already at 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. That is not just success, that is the audience telling the industry that adaptation can be extravagant, weird, and still emotionally faithful if it respects the original spirit. And then there is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which made $190.2 million domestic, while also resetting the visual language of comic-to-film translation. It did not merely adapt a comic book sensibility, it made cinema think like a comic.
I like your suit.
Thanks. I made it myself.
That was adorable, team! Now hold on tight!
Without losing its own identity. That is why it works. It is not trapped by the source. It is inspired by it. This is why adaptation debates get so emotional online. Fans are not just defending trivia, they are defending ownership, or at least the feeling of it. On forums and fan communities, the same arguments come up again and again. Some people say Percy Jackson failed because it changed too much. Others say faithful adaptations can still fail if they are boring. Some argue Resident Evil stopped being Resident Evil the moment it abandoned horror for action. Others say the films became their own thing and should be judged that way. The pattern is always the same. The fight is never simply over plot. It is over what the story is supposed to feel like, and who gets to decide that. That is why the authorial intent versus director vision question is so sticky. The author created the original emotional grammar. The director is trying to remake it in another language. The audience is standing between them, deciding which version speaks more clearly. Sometimes the audience sides with the author, sometimes with the director. Sometimes they build an entirely new canon out of the adaptation and the source together. That is what happened with Harry Potter, The Godfather, Jaws, and now even newer successes like The Last of Us and One Piece. The story becomes bigger than the page, because the audience keeps it alive in multiple forms. The problem is that once a story becomes communal property in the cultural sense, nobody gets to fully control it anymore. Not even the person who wrote it first. So whose story is it? The authors? The directors? The fan bases? Maybe the honest answer is that it becomes all of theirs, but not equally, and not at the same time. The author starts the fire. The director shapes the flame. The audience decides whether it becomes a candle, a bonfire, or a legend. That is why some adaptations are remembered as revelations, some as betrayals, and some as both. The best ones do not simply copy the source. They understand why the source mattered, then find a new way to make that feeling alive. Villeneuve called adaptation treason, but also said he tried to preserve the poetry of the book. Riordan called the Percy Jackson script terrible, but later returned to the world to do it differently. Ebert argued that faithfulness is not automatically a virtue. The data says audiences reward adaptations that preserve spirit, not just structure. The debate keeps returning because it is not really about books versus movies. It is about what happens when one mind's vision has to survive inside another medium. That is the real ethics of adaptation. Not copying, not erasing. Translating what matters most, then having the courage to let the rest change.